In the brittle dawn of spring, 1834, the plantation exhaled a heavy stillness, a breath held too long under the weight of its own unyielding silence. A deep, unnatural quiet wrapped the land, as if the earth itself anticipated the gathering storm. Each wooden beam of the slave quarters creaked low under the muffled hush, while above the sprawling limbs of ancient oaks stretched wide in somber witness. The soil beneath, dark, tilled, and rich with the scent of damp ash, offered no comfort, only the faintest tremor beneath each footfall. Why did the stillness feel more like a shroud than a calm? Such silence often preluded a breaking. Amid this tense pause, she moved with deliberate softness, a shadow within shadows. Her eyes, steady and sharp as broken flint, remained fixed on the manor house where the master held court, an edifice heavy with the ropes of power and cruelty. The coarse roughness of her linen skirt brushed against pale, frozen grass, each step swallowed by the thick, cold soil. Around her, the land bloomed defiantly, wild flowers edged the paths, and the first buds swelled slow beneath the promise of summer. But life's bloom seemed a brittle mask, a sharp contrast to the tightening noose of control that gripped every breath, leaf, and whispered word. Could the earth's vibrant life conceal the rot that festered beneath? Bird song punctured the silence, distant yet deliberate, the metallic trill of a blackbird, the hesitant call of a thrush weaving through the cool air. These sounds, ordinarily signs of renewal, here played the role of deceiver, muffling the clatter of iron chains and the muted groans that seldom rose above the whistling wind. The birds' notes hung like fragile threads, tenuous connections to a freer world. Yet, amidst their song, an unspoken tension thickened, the heavy breath before the rupture. What binds a soul when the air itself seems to tighten, pressing deeper into the chest, making each inhale a choice between endurance and rebellion? In the quarters, the flicker of lamp oil struggled against stubborn shadows. Worn wooden floors bore the weight of countless passing feet, their grooves smoothed by years of quiet servitude. She paused, hands clenched at her sides, fingertips pressing against the coarse fabric of her sleeve, muscles taut beneath skin, like the stretched cords of a bow. Her breath was steady, belying the storm behind her gaze, an unspoken pact forged from the harsh lessons of survival. Every whispered order, every lash of the whip, carved away a piece of her spirit, replaced by a quiet fire, cold and resolute. Would the land remember this silence when the storm finally broke? Outside, the master's voice would soon cut across the morning air, a growl, sharp and commanding, a sound worn as deeply as the marks on a leather whip. This voice, the instrument of his cruelty, ruled the plantation with iron timber, disallowing any dissent or question. Yet today, the quiet seemed pregnant with something unvoiced, something that no command could clamp down. The rigid order of plantation life held, for now, but beneath it, a slow gathering defiance, stirred like a chill wind, threading through the trees. What price must be paid to silence a voice that dares to cry out? In the hush before the storm, the boundaries of power felt both absolute and fragile, poised between ancestral traditions and the restless fury of those bound beneath. Here, amid the scent of cold earth and pine sap, the story of one woman's silent resistance began, not with shouts or chains broken, but with an act carried in the ghost of a whisper, a dark promise encased in silence. The severed tongue that would soon fall upon a dinner plate was not just flesh, but a symbol carved from years of muted suffering and hard-won courage, a quiet defiance against an empire built on stolen voices. What secret does silence keep when it becomes a weapon? Thus, the stage was set under a sky draped in gray, the plantation at twilight before dawn, suspended in a moment that held the weight of inevitability and the first stirrings of revolt. The land, the air, the very bones of the place held their breath, waiting. And in this poised calm, a single act of rebellion awaited its time to break loose and reshape everything that lay beneath the oak's enduring watch. The master's voice was an iron hammer against the morning's fragile quiet. At the far edge of the Virginia plantation, the heavy timber house brooded like a stern god, watching over its flock. Unyielding and indifferent, its weathered boards, blackened by age and smoke, held the memory of harsh commands and broken bodies. The scent of stove-cast iron mingled with the faint smoke of pine fires burning low in the hearth, a reminder that warmth could quickly turn to ash. Out front, the dirt yard spread cracked and scarred, pressed hard by years of wheels and feet, the powdered grit biting faintly at bare ankles moving too close. Within this world, enslaved people labored from first light, their movements measured against rules etched deeply into the rhythm of the day. The sharp sting of a whip or a snapped command could cut the air as surely as the master's words, designed to discipline and remind all of their place. Fields heavy with tobacco leaves required endless tending, the stalks brushed by hands calloused and cracked, streaked with soil's reddish dust. Clothing made of coarse linen and homespun cloth, scraped roughly against sunburned skin. Records imply the hours stretched long under a blistering sun, and the weight of owning one's breath was heavier than the heaviest hemp rope. Life in the slave quarters was a world apart, but chained to the planter's will. These quarters, simple wooden shacks with dirt floors and leaky roofs, offered scant protection from weather's mercy or cruelty. The thin blankets, worn to threads, barely warmed the wearers on chill nights. The kitchen hum, low and constant, echoed with wooden spoons, stirring stews thick with peas and salt pork, a staple ration just enough to sustain bones through toil. The smell of burning tallow candles was ever present, flickering weak light over faces etched with weariness, hope, and hardened resolve. Each whispered word carried the weight of secrecy, and every glance weighed the risk of discovery. The plantation's harsh laws cast long shadows. Virginia slave codes forbade assembly and the teaching of literacy, forbidding the very tools that might fuel rebellion. Punishments for disobedience ranged from lashings to mutilation, markers of ownership enforced with brutal efficiency. Records from the period reveal a grim ledger of pain, iron collars to choke and bind, stocks and chains to punish and humiliate. Yet, the ledger often leaves gaps over acts of quiet resistance, small rebellions fought with stolen moments, forbidden songs, and one woman's silent planning beneath the canopy of ancient trees. Would you risk all for a chance to reclaim a fragment of yourself in a world designed to break you? The air buzzed with unspoken tension. The constant presence of overseers and the master's unpredictable wrath fostered a hush that was both suffocating and strategic. Any sound out of place might provoke violence, yet this silence also wove its own language, one pregnant with concealed fury and impending upheaval. The woman's steady hands, brushing against rough wood and cold metal, hinted at a silent resolve growing like a black thorn in spring. In this crucible of nature, law, and survival, the first flickers of resistance took shape, fragile as the new leaves trembling on the stiff branches above. The plantation breathed around her, burdened and watchful, as a storm gathered in the stillness before breaking. The coming act would redraw the boundaries of silence and power, a speechless scream carved into flesh and memory. The land, heavy beneath the weight of history, awaited the moment when the unspoken would strike with irreversible force. The law in Virginia in 1834 was an iron grip tightening on every breath taken by the enslaved. The Virginia Slave Codes of 1705, continuously reinforced and sharpened, left no room for mercy. These codes declared black people, and those of mixed blood, as chattel, property to be commanded, punished, or disposed of at the whim of the master. The scent of tallow candles flickering over the pages of these cold laws seemed a cruel echo in the silent quarters where enslaved people whispered their fears. Punishments for any infraction, real or imagined, were swift and brutal. Whipping was common, wielded with cattle-hide whips so thick and heavy that a single lash could leave a deep, gashing wound. Records describe the cowskin whip, with its stiffened oxhide, capable of tearing flesh and hurling shock through silent bodies. Women were not spared. Accounts suggest overseers devised cruel methods so lashings could be administered even to pregnant women without harming their unborn child, sometimes digging pits to shield the child, while the mother was lashed. This grim practicality testified to the callousness embedded in the system. Maiming and public disfigurement were also tools of terror, designed not just to punish, but to shatter spirit and serve as warnings to others. The law permitted masters to wield such violence without fear of prosecution, for the enslaved were deemed less than human, devoid of legal rights to plead innocence or appeal punishments. Could there be any justice beneath a system where courts called oyer and terminer judged enslaved people without juries, where sentences ended in executions, brutal lashings, or exile from their community without voice or defense? Beyond physical punishment, Virginia codes forbade movement, assembly, and even the teaching of literacy. Enslaved people needed written passes to leave the plantation. Any breach risked harsh retribution. Curfews and restrictions on gatherings sought to strangle the breath of rebellion before it could swell into open resistance. Even free black people suffered under these suffocating laws, bound by the same fearful system that hunted and punished runaway slaves relentlessly. Would you stand still, knowing the smallest transgression, slow work, a whispered defiance, a furtive glance, could provoke a storm of violence? Would silent endurance become your strength, or your shackle? Amongst the droning grind of daily labor, the subtle tension of these laws fell on the enslaved like iron dust, settling in every fold of fabric, every cracked palm, every weary breath. Each act of obedience was a fragile thread woven tightly in the web of survival, fraying under the weight of unrelenting cruelty. Yet, amid this grim architecture of law and discipline, accounts suggest sparks of resistance flickered quietly. Acts small yet daring, breaking tools, stealing food, secret songs, and stolen words whispered at night, wove a hidden undercurrent beneath daily submission. The woman, eyes watching, hands steady, belonged to this shadow world of contained fury. Though the law sought to confine her to silence, her resolve began to sharpen into something far more dangerous, a silent act of defiance that would echo far beyond the plantation and its dread laws. The law may have defined her as property, but her spirit held its own language, a language that no whip or code could erase, the language of a severed tongue waiting to be unleashed. The master's voice cut sharply through the morning mist, a brutal summons cloaked in clipped commands. His words were fewer than usual, but each carried the weight of a whip cracked in the air, an unyielding reminder of the rigid hierarchy that governed every breath and step. The plantation house, a squat timber structure blackened with age and smoke, held centuries of unspoken menace within its thick walls. Around it, the clutter of tools, hoes, scythes, and buckets, lay abandoned momentarily, as if the land itself paused, sensing the quiet before the coming storm. Enslaved lives moved in silent rhythm, shadowed under the ever-watchful eyes of the overseer and the law. The Virginia slave codes, strict and unforgiving, were etched into daily life like iron scars. These laws forbade movement without permission, prohibited assembly, and forbade literacy, stripping away the most basic tools of freedom. Here, every step outside designated paths was an act of potential rebellion, punishable by lashings with the notorious cowskin whip, hard as seasoned oak, its strokes capable of gashing skin and tearing flesh with a whistle through the air. But the punishment was as much spectacle as deterrent, designed to break bodies and spirits alike, instilling terror and enforcing submission. Towards the edge of the tobacco fields, the smell of sweat, freshly turned earth, and damp cloth was pungent. A woman's hands, roughened by constant labor, brushed the coarse weave of sackcloth as she tended rows of brittle stalks. Her gaze, steady and unreadable, lingered beyond the horizon to the heavy, low-lying sun that promised long hours to come. Each breath drawn was measured. She knew the dangers of speaking too loud, moving too fast, living too freely. Yet beneath this stillness, a slow, gathering tension thickened the air, a promise whispered silently in the rustling leaves. The codes permitted masters to inflict brutal punishment without fear of repercussions. Lashes, branding, even mutilation were tools wielded to fortify control. A woman, even heavy with child, was not exempt. overseers devised grim methods to carry out punishment while preserving the unborn as property. Records suggest such calculated cruelty was ordinary. The master's will absolute. Would you hold your tongue if the price of speech was flesh torn raw? Would silence protect you or bind you tighter than any chain? Near the quarters, low murmurs of forbidden song and secret prayers threaded through the night air like smoke from a dying fire. A man's raspy whisper, a mother's gentle hum. These fragile acts of resistance were often the only refuge from a harsh reality defined by submission and pain. The clipped commands within the house, the crack of the overseer's whip, and the chilling laws converged to create a world where even the faintest breath of defiance risked swift retribution. Yet in this crucible of oppression, the woman's silence was not resignation, but a gathering storm. Beneath the bloom of spring, the plantation lay still, deceptive, as the calm before a hurricane. Every touch of earth, every call of a distant bird seemed to carry the weight of watchful gazes and unspoken threats. And in the growing twilight of this quiet day, a single act of uprising awaited its moment, a severed tongue poised to shatter silence and remake the meaning of speech itself. In 1834, Virginia, the slave codes cemented a brutal reality where enslaved people, stripped of all rights, existed solely as the property of their masters. The laws gave unchecked power to slaveholders, explicitly permitting punishment without fear of legal consequences. If a slave resisted correction, even if that correction resulted in death, the master was absolved of all blame, as if the loss were no more than an accident of discipline. This grim legality ensnared every aspect of daily life, shaping a world where violence was normalized and justice systematically denied. Punishments were often horrifyingly inventive, yet meticulously calculated to preserve the laborer's body while demolishing spirit. Whippings were common, delivered by the infamous cowskin whip made of dried oxhide, hard and springy, capable of tearing the flesh with a whistle through the air. Accounts suggest the whip was as close as an overseer could keep, ever ready to bite into skin and scatter pain like ash. Even pregnancy was no shield. Overseers would dig pits to cradle a woman's belly, allowing lashes to rain down while protecting the unborn child, a grim testament to the system's cold preservation of property over personhood. Other penalties included shackling, branding, and maiming. The code allowed for stocks and pillories to punish theft or minor insubordination, sometimes demanding the cutting off of ears as public warnings affixed in flesh. Such punishments weren't merely correctional, but ritualized displays meant to terrorize and assert dominance. The law transformed every master into judge, jury, and executioner within the plantation's narrow confines, rendering the enslaved utterly vulnerable to brutality cloaked in cruel legality. The slave codes also restricted freedoms beyond the physical. Written permission was required to leave the plantation. Literacy was forbidden to enslaved people, striking at the heart of knowledge as power. Assembly bans strangled any hope of organized resistance, while free black people were corralled into the same legal system and often sold into slavery as punishment. This legal framework created a pervasive atmosphere of fear and surveillance, with draconian penalties meted out for even the faintest step perceived as defiance. Would you bear such absolute control? Your body owned, your voice silenced, your very existence weighed as property? The system demanded more than obedience. It demanded erasure of identity and will. Yet within this suffocating law lay the seeds of subtle rebellion, where silence could be louder than any shout, and a single severed tongue could echo louder than any command. Within these cruel legal cages, the woman's quiet resolve began to take form, a slow-burning defiance, as unforgiving and inevitable as the law was merciless. The plantation's silence concealed more than fear. It hid a shape-shifting resistance, crafted not in open revolt, but in a language carved from the deepest wounds of the enslaved. The question was no longer whether defiance would come, it was how and at what cost. The house stood rigid under the low Virginia sun, its timbers worn and scarred like the hands that worked its fields. Inside, the master's presence was felt even in silence, a weight pressing on every whispered word and guarded glance. His cruelty was not only in the swift crack of his whip, but in the cold decree of law that rendered every enslaved person voiceless, property without recourse or defense. Virginia's slave codes, inked in the legislatures of centuries past, allowed masters to rule without restraint. The 1705 Code starkly decreed that any slave resisting correction, even if that correction resulted in death, the master faced no punishment, an unbreakable shield for cruelty. More than mere guidelines, these codes legalized violence as a tool of ownership. Were these laws a grotesque contract, binding masters to dominance and enslaved bodies to unending subjugation? Punishments ranged from lashings by the notorious cowskin whip, a springy oxhide weapon that cracked through the air with the sharp whistle of pain, to branding and maiming designed to mark bodies as property. Pregnant women were not spared. Overseers would dig shallow pits for their bellies, allowing lashings to rain upon them while preserving the unborn child, a cruel testament to the plantation's cold calculus of property value over human life. Would such calculated cruelty break the strongest spirit or kindle a deeper hidden fire? The codes forbade literacy, restricted movement without written passes, and outlawed gatherings among enslaved people, embedding surveillance and control into everyday life. Free Black people were subjected to equivalent laws, often hunted, imprisoned, or sold into slavery under the same harsh system. The law sought to strangle every breath of autonomy and resistance before it could rise. The woman's gaze never left the master's house, a fortress built on bones and silence. Every step she took was measured. Her hands tightened against the rough fabric of her dress, and her breath slow but fierce beneath the weight of looming violence. While the law sought to shatter her will, her resolve gathered like a storm beneath calm skies, a silence destined to roar in the violence of a single defiant act. Would defiance bloom in such a place, or wither under the perennial shadow of brutal order? The plantation held its breath, waiting to see which would break first, the silence or the chains. The Virginia slave codes of 1705 formalized a system of cruel and calculated oppression that defined the contours of enslaved life for generations. The law was explicit: all Africans and their descendants brought into the colony were slaves for life, real estate to be bought, sold, and controlled with absolute authority. The act laid bare the colony's intent to entrench racial slavery, erasing any earlier ambiguities around servitude and binding enslaved people and their offspring to lifelong bondage. Among these laws was the chilling provision that if a slave resisted correction, whatever form that punishment took, and was killed in the process, the master or overseer was free of all legal consequences. This gave free rein to violent discipline, legalizing acts that today would be unthinkable. The whip, branding iron, and other instruments of pain were tools officially sanctioned, a grim extension of property rights. How does a law reconcile with humanity when it sanctions death without punishment? The codes further forbade enslaved people from possessing weapons or leaving plantations without written permission, enforcing an all-pervasive control. Any violation invited immediate capture and brutal punishment, usually 20 lashes, administered without trial. Public proclamations naming fugitive slaves were posted on church doors, offering rewards for their capture or even permission for anyone to kill them if they resisted. The atmosphere was one of unrelenting surveillance and terror, a grim architecture built to fracture community and hope. Even baptism offered no reprieve. The codes explicitly stated that conversion to Christianity did not exempt enslaved individuals from bondage, undercutting any religious arguments for liberation. The brutal principle of partus sequitur ventrum was enshrined. Children followed the status of their mother, perpetuating slavery through generations. Legal rights and personhood were systematically stripped away, replaced by a pervasive legal machinery designed to control, punish, and erase. Would you have conceived of resistance under a law that rendered you mere property, your pain and life dispensable? These codes aimed not merely to control bodies, but to dominate souls, to silence all dissent with iron and law. Yet in their shadow, the seeds of defiance took root, silent and hidden, but no less potent. The law could imprison the body, but the spirit could still find ways to speak, and sometimes to cut through silence itself. The Virginia Slave Code of 1705 stands as the legal bedrock of oppression, cementing racial slavery with chilling precision. This comprehensive act not only codified the transformation of many Africans from indentured servants into lifelong slaves, but also detailed their total subjugation under colonial law. The code explicitly declared that any servant brought into Virginia who was not Christian was to be deemed a slave, permanently bound to servitude, regardless of conversion, wiping away any chance of spiritual liberation or freedom through faith. One of the most harrowing provisions was the absolute authority it granted to masters and overseers. The code allowed correction of slaves with no legal consequence for the master, even if the punishment resulted in death. It explicitly stated that if a slave resisted correction and was killed, it shall not be accounted felony, effectively legalizing lethal violence under the guise of discipline. The law sanctioned brutal punishments such as whipping, branding, and maiming, all tools meant to enforce submission and instill terror. Yet it paradoxically forbade immoderate correction of Christian white servants, distinguishing racial lines in the exercise of violence. Other provisions guarded the surveillance and control integral to maintaining slavery. Slaves were forbidden from carrying arms or leaving their plantations without written permission from their masters or overseers. Any slave caught without such certificates faced immediate and harsh corporal punishment, most commonly 20 lashes on the bare back, administered by constables without trial or delay. This rigid regulation of movement ensured the total confinement and surveillance of enslaved populations across the colony. The code also reinforced social segregation, barring free blacks, Native Americans, and others from purchasing white Christian servants, while imposing harsh penalties for interracial relationships involving slaves. By entrenching racial hierarchies legally, it hindered any potential alliances between oppressed groups and fortified white supremacy through law. Would you imagine a system so calculated to extinguish voice and resistance, where law itself was weaponized to turn bodies into property and pain into obedience? Yet, beneath this legal edifice, it is the very existence of such codes that marks the inevitability of defiance in whispers, in resistance, and ultimately in acts born from the deepest silences. It is within this cruel legal framework that one woman's silent retribution would unfold, shaking the plantation's foundation and rewriting the meaning of voice itself. The Virginia Slave Codes of 1705 formed a vast and brutal legal network that enshrined slavery as both property and punishment under colonial law. The codes created explicit racial distinctions, ensuring that Africans and their descendants were property for life, rather than transient servants. This legal foundation blocked any chance for freedom through conversion to Christianity, stating clearly that baptism would not alter an enslaved person's status. Every child born to an enslaved woman would inherit this bondage, sealed by the principle partus sequitur ventrum. One key provision granted masters absolute authority, allowing harsh correction without fear of prosecution, even if that punishment ended in death. The law protected those who inflicted lashes, branding, or worse, declaring that such acts shall not be accounted felony. This gave plantation owners and overseers a chilling license to wield extreme violence as a tool of control and terror. By contrast, the codes forbade immoderate correction of white Christian servants, highlighting both the racial basis and cruelty of the system. The codes also strictly regulated movement and behavior. Enslaved people could not leave their assigned lands without written permission, carry weapons, or assemble in groups, a regime maintained through constant surveillance and brutal enforcement. If caught violating these restrictions, punishments were swift and public. 20 lashes on the bare back administered by constables without trial, serving both to discipline and display dominance. Rewards encouraged white citizens to hunt and capture runaway slaves, embedding violence into everyday life. Social control extended further. The codes prohibited interracial marriages and interactions, with heavy punishments and automatic manumission for white Christian servants who came into the ownership or relationship with non-white persons. These measures reinforced a rigid racial order, underpinning white supremacy with legal force. Would you survive in a world where law and violence were one, where every act of resistance risked a swift backlash sanctioned by court? The codes sought to break bodies and spirits alike, silencing voices even as they were forced into unwanted servitude. Yet, beneath their heavy shadow, defiance simmered. The woman's silence on this plantation was no submission, but a vessel of quiet rebellion, a tension that, when finally released, would sever more than a tongue. It would cut into the very heart of oppression. The Virginia Slave Code of 1705 was a sweeping legal framework that shaped every facet of enslaved life and set the foundation for the system's rigidity. The act was far-reaching, consisting of 41 clauses that tightly controlled both slaves and indentured servants. One significant provision mandated that masters provide wholesome and competent diet, clothing, and lodging to their servants and slaves, judged by county court's discretion. Yet, this was a grim gesture overshadowed by harsher measures that permitted immoderate correction of slaves with near impunity. The code forbade masters from whipping Christian white servants naked without an order from a justice of the peace, with penalties imposed if such abuse occurred without authorization. However, when it came to enslaved Africans and others assigned to slavery, these legal protections evaporated. The law explicitly stated that if any slave resisted correction and was killed during punishment, the master or overseer bore no legal consequence whatsoever. This provision legalized lethal violence disguised as discipline and emboldened the culture of brutality. Movement restrictions were strictly enforced. No slave could carry arms or leave the plantation without written permission. A certificate granted by a master, mistress, or overseer was mandatory. Anyone caught violating this faced instant punishment, 20 lashes on the bare back administered swiftly by constables without legal process. Such laws ensured constant surveillance and maintained a landscape of fear where every step beyond the sanctioned boundaries risked pain and humiliation. The Slave Code further regulated ownership and social order. It prohibited non-white individuals from purchasing Christian servants, and any interracial relationships involving slaves were heavily punished. Servants or slaves found trading without their master's consent faced penalties, while runaway slaves were subject to rewards posted publicly for their capture, illustrating how deeply intertwined property rights and violence were. Would you have imagined a world so thoroughly designed to strip you of voice, movement, and dignity? This law was both a shield and a weapon for master and overseer, structuring oppression with chilling precision. But beneath these rigid codes lay human lives aware of their bonds, gathering strength in hidden resistance. For one woman on this Virginia plantation, the law's silence would be broken in an act both shocking and silent, the cutting of a tongue that spoke volumes in its absence. The enforcement of the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705 was as relentless as the laws were cruelly written. Authority was widely dispersed to ensure tight control over enslaved populations, with local courts, justices of the peace, constables, and even ordinary white citizens empowered to enforce and supervise punishment. County courts held power not only to oversee conditions of diet, clothing, and lodging for enslaved people, but also to adjudicate complaints and impose sales or punishment if masters failed in their duties. This legal apparatus was woven deeply into the fabric of planter society, enforcing a hierarchy as rigid as iron shackles. Enforcement was uncompromisingly swift and public. For example, no enslaved person could carry weapons or leave the plantation without written permission. Constables were empowered to apprehend any slave found violating this rule and administer 20 lashes immediately, without judicial hearing or trial. Public proclamations of runaway slaves were posted on church doors on Sundays, heightening terror through ritual surveillance. These proclamations identified fugitives and offered bounties, incentivizing citizens to hunt and capture enslaved individuals. The sheriff was authorized to assemble forces and use force as they shall think fit, including lethal violence, to apprehend runaways who resisted. Courts wielded broad discretion to impose punishments ranging from whipping to mutilations designed to terrorize and control. For incorrigible slaves, judges could order dismemberment, short of taking life, to serve as a warning to others. The law also protected masters from charges if a slave died while resisting correction, effectively legalizing lethal punishment. Even the prosecution of those who harbored or aided runaway slaves was vigorously pursued, with fines and corporal punishment serving as deterrents. Social enforcement was equally rigorous. Laws restricted not only the enslaved, but also free black people and poor whites, policing interracial interactions, property ownership, and economic independence. The legal system reinforced these controls through severe penalties for violations, creating an omnipresent network of scrutiny and repression. Would you endure a world where everyone carried the authority to punish and to watch, where the law endorsed invisible chains tightening around your every move? The system was designed to suffocate resistance before it could rise, yet it also made inevitable the cracks in this legal armor, hidden fissures where rebellion could gather strength, silently, patiently, unseen but unbroken. The plantation awaited its reckoning, where one woman's defiant silence would speak volumes in a single, unyielding act. Amid the brutal constraints imposed by the Virginia slave codes, resistance simmered both openly and in the covert spaces carved out by enslaved people. The codes themselves revealed the colonists' fears, fear of rebellion, solidarity, and the power of collective defiance. Following Bacon's rebellion in 1676, the colony deliberately separated white indentured servants from black enslaved laborers to forestall alliances, planting deep seeds of mistrust and division. Yet despite these barriers woven of law and terror, enslaved people fought back in myriad ways, crafting survival and resistance from every tool offered. Open revolt was perilous and rare, but recorded histories and notices testify to the courage of those who dared escape or resist. Thousands ran away, risking brutal punishment or death, often traveling great distances through hostile terrain in desperate pursuit of freedom. The law's stringent regulation of movement, with mandatory passes and immediate corporal punishment for transgressors, sought to choke off this escape route. Yet fugitives repeatedly defied the codes, their flight an urgent, living retort to captivity. Advertisements of runaway slaves posted on church doors offered up to tens of pounds in tobacco for capture, confirming how widespread and feared such flight was. Beyond flight, subtle forms of resistance flourished within the confines of bondage. Slowing work paces, feigning illness, breaking tools, and stealing food became acts of quiet rebellion, tangible assertions of agency in a world designed to erase it. Oral traditions, music, and religious expression formed crucial cultural bulwarks, carrying hope, community, and coded messages across plantations. These expressions sustained identity and offered emotional escape from the harshness of imposed silence. Would you find solace in a whispered song where words were forbidden? How would small acts of defiance ripple through a world built on control? The law's attempts to divide, through prohibiting assembly, literacy, and cross-racial solidarity, never fully extinguished human endurance or the desire for freedom. In fact, the very existence of these laws reveals the resilience they sought to suppress. The woman's silent defiance on this Virginia plantation was part of this continuum, an act not only of personal assertion, but connected to centuries of resistance, echoing louder than the cruel codes that sought to silence her. In this tension between law, surveillance, brutal enforcement, and undying resolve, her story unfolds, a haunting testament to rebellion shaped not in grand battles, but carved in silence, and the sharp edge of justice sought with quiet ferocity.